This is Monica Perez here with the third installment of this, my favorite book by my favorite conspiracy researcher. It's Mass Control Engineering Human Consciousness by Jim Keith. And this is another edition of a book that, here, I think this was the original Mind Control, World Control, the Encyclopedia of Mind Control. This book is better, the one I'm reading to you. And Jim said that this book is just a rewrite of that book because he came up with a lot more research. It's a great book. Okay, so let's hit it. Chapter 6, Subverting Sex. So if you've been missing any of these, I have the octopus and this in a playlist on YouTube. You can also go to monicaperezshow.com and whatever, search for it there. It'll come up. There's actually a category. If you go to the menu, there's like a listen category and it says story time and the books are there. So you can go there and it'll get you to all those posts. But all right. So I'm assuming you're caught up. Let's do it. Another loyal foot soldier in the program for the subjugation of the masses was Rockefeller-funded Alfred C. Kinsey, the co-author of the influential Sexual Behavior in the Human Male and other volumes. One technique of eugenics and control is that little acknowledged is the destruction of traditional morality and the normalizing of deviancy. Kinsey studied at the Bussey Institute at Harvard in the 1920s, at the time a hotbed of eugenics research, then moved on to teach at Indiana University, where his work in cultural destruction would ultimately succeed in decimating American sexual mores, help to fragment the American family, and leave the population still more vulnerable to reproductive, cultural, familial, and mind programming. Kinsey, always portrayed in the press as a wholesome Leave It to Beaver style family man, was, quote, one of the scholarly eugenicists of pre-World War II, according to biographer James Jones, and recommended that a portion of the lower classes, quote, should be sterilized to foster a more robust gene pool. Among Kinsey's intimates was Dr. Ewan Cameron, the infamous Canadian mind control doctor who will be treated in a later chapter. In many ways, what took place at Kinsey's research laboratory is highly reminiscent of what was going on at intelligence agency psychiatric labs at the same time. Another of Kinsey's influences was Dr. Herman Muller, a colleague at Indiana University. Muller, who had begun receiving Rockefeller funding from the National Research Council in 1925, received a Guggenheim grant in 1932 to pursue his work in the genetics department of the Rockefeller-funded Kaiser Wilhelm Brain Research Institute in Berlin. Muller studied under Ernst Rudin, who was to become the head of the Nazi Racial Hygiene Society. Wow. One of the benefits of Rudin's policy for the extermination of hereditary undesirables was that it provided a continual harvesting of fresh brains for the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute's Brain Research Division. According to Roderick Gorney in his book, The Human Agenda, quote, the more radical method of genetic intervention is called positive eugenics. This is a more ambitious and controversial proposal, championed, among others, by the late Herman Muller, who advocated selective breeding to eliminate the defects and to increase the number of people with superior qualities. One way to accomplish this would be to establish sperm and eventually egg banks. They're talking about this 100 years ago. We certainly have this, and they're definitely like selected. You look and see. I know a kid who, like, it was one of those kids who graduated college where most people are doing high school, went to an extremely prestigious university. But I remember when his moms went sperm shopping, and I'm pretty sure they picked with intention. Banks in which, sperm banks, in which the reproductive cells and egg banks, that also happens, the reproductive cells of individuals with the exceptional health, intelligence, or special talent could be preserved. These could then be used by people who want to produce children with better endowment than would result from their own genes. Some have objected that people would not willingly agree to substitute the sex cells and characteristics of others for their own. Mueller rejects the stultifying assumption that people would have to be forced rather than inspired to engage in any effective kind of genetic betterment. He points out that seemingly, quote, normal couples would elect to use this means of having at least a part of their family. That would be if you make couples who are perforce infertile, so same-sex couples. And I always wondered, I was like, do you really, if you're a same-sex couple and you want to have kids, do you really have to go through all that? Can't you just get drunk and go to a bar, or ask, asking for a friend, are you available for sperm donation tonight? That sounds like that would be a bad cut. Don't anybody cut that. Anyway, I just feel like they made it so complicated and artificial, and I'm certain that, I would find it hard to believe that this wasn't part of the plan. Another of Kinsey's apparent influences was the occultist Aleister Crowley, whose Thelema Abbey Kinsey visited shortly before his death in 1955. Although it has not been established that Kinsey used Crowley as a research source in his books, they shared mutual friends and acquaintances such as filmmaker Kenneth Anger, American Nazi George Sylvester Viereck, and Frenchman René Guyon. Kenneth Anger has said that Kinsey was obsessed with obtaining the great beasts, Crowley's, day-to-day sex diaries. To obtain grant monies and maintain the support of the university, Kinsey needed the excuse of research to validate his 24 hours a day obsession with sex. However, Proc's, Kinsey's nickname, Proc's battle cry of "do your best and let other people react as they will" seemed a variation on Crowley's "do what thou wilt" maxim. If in fact such was the case, I wonder how the American public would have reacted to find out that the highly respected Kinsey was a disciple of the great beast. Kinsey's most effective weapon for the psychological warfare was his Rockefeller-funded study of American sexuality, the most famous volume being his vaunted study, Sexual Behavior in the Human Male, published in 1948. Upon release of the book, 200,000 copies were sold in 2 months, primarily due to the championing of the volume by American media and the Rockefellers. Absolutely, yes, that would do it. According to Renee Wormser, I have 2 books of Renee Wormser's on my shelf. Yes, he was legal counsel for the Reese Committee investigating tax-exempt foundations in 1954. Yes, that famous conversation that G. Edward Griffin had with Norman Dodd, who was the head researcher of that. This Renee Wormser was Norman Dodd's legal counsel on that. And I have a book on, I think it's just called The Law. It's kind of the history of the law. I bought it for a friend, but I said, just stop reading after Abraham Lincoln. And he said, this is a guy from Texas. He said, I always stop reading history books after Abraham Lincoln. Because I think he gets that all wrong. But one of his books another book I have of Renee Wormser's is The Myth of the Good and Bad Nation. And he was talking about demonizing enemies to facilitate war enthusiasm or to facilitate a war, the myth of good and bad nations. And I think maybe I looked into it, and I think maybe Wormser was Jewish. So to start saying that stuff in 1954 or whenever he was active, I might have to revisit that book. All right. So this is a quote from Wormser. The Rockefeller Foundation's statement filed with the committee explained its connection with the Kinsey studies in this way. So this is Renee Wormser telling us what the Rockefeller Foundation, because this was all part of the House Un-American Activities Committee stuff, and as it should be. And there, as this little aside, I think their recommendation was to have a rule against perpetuities for tax-exempt foundations, maybe even corporations, but specifically for tax-exempt foundations. Because if you die with a lot of money, your will can only extend to maybe 20 years past the last person mentioned in the will's death. So you cannot rule from the grave, which is really critical because land needs to keep getting freed up. You cannot have, you don't realize how important that is, that rich guys from the past cannot control the future. But the tax exempt foundations is a way for them to do that. They can put their money in a bank. They can put their desire, their plan to shape the world. Their descendants forever can feed off of that. There's no rule against perpetuities for tax-exempt foundations, and that's what these guys wanted. So I guess they were investigating them, and the Rockefeller Foundation submitted a report. And Renee Wormser is talking about it. It said in 1931, it, quote, became interested in systematic support for studies in sexual physiology and behavior. Its work in these areas was chiefly in connection with the, quote, Committee for Research in Problems of Sex of the National Research Council, to which by 1954, the foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, had granted $1,755,000. So prior to 1954, in annual grants running from $75,000 to $240,000. Beginning about 1941, a considerable portion of these funds was supplied to Dr. Kinsey's studies, and one grant was made direct to Dr. Kinsey. The work of the NRC produced some results of truly noteworthy importance. However, the much publicized bestseller Kinsey Studies base an advocacy of criminal and social reform on the very unscientific material which Dr. Kinsey had collected and permitted to be widely disseminated. Just an aside, Harry asks if there's a good book on the history of tax-exempt foundations. The Wormser book on tax-exempt foundations, so I have 3 books of his. I mean, that's worth having, and you can probably get it for a song if you get it right now. Anytime I mention books on the show, oh my gosh, they go through the roof. I don't know about that one. Tax-exempt foundations might not. Even the algorithm might be like, really? I'm not worried about this one going viral. Anyway, yeah, it was totally unscientific, this Kinsey stuff. Later debunked. According to Judith A. Reisman, PhD, the author of the book called Kinsey, Crimes and Consequences, she says, Kinsey's quantitative research and his numbers were a perfect fit for Rockefeller to utilize the mass media to shape public attitudes and conduct. Attitudes were changed through mass communications, which caused a rejection of chastity, self-control, and moral public governance, as well as increased illicit sexual conduct. Social management of this sort was nothing less for Rockefeller than changing America's way of life by, among other things, altering what Kinsey would call breeding patterns along an evolutionary or animalistic view of human sexual conduct. So the tax-exempt foundations investigation that Wormser was a part of and Norman Dodd was a part of, that was when they talked about the Carnegie Foundation. They looked at the earliest notes of the Carnegie Foundation and found that it wanted to do the same thing. It wanted to change society from being individualistic to being collectivist, and asked the question presented and meant to be answered was, what is the best way to do that? And they came up with war, and then dedicated themselves to getting us involved in World War I. And the researcher, Catherine Casey, maybe her name was, who actually went in there to the archives of the Carnegie Foundation and read all that stuff. She had tapes that she was like recording what she was finding, and she could never work again. They say she lost her mind, but she just, she lost it enough to not be able to function. She just, ripping the scales from her eyes was just too much. The main problem with Kinsey's quantitative research and his numbers is that they were radically skewed in order to achieve his own purposes. Researchers into Kinsey's methods, which purportedly catalog normal sexuality in America, have noted that he loaded the ranks of his test subjects with an inordinately high number of persons imprisoned for sex deviancy, prostitutes, and child molesters, criminals estimated by one researcher as providing as high as 1/3 of his overall subjects. Kinsey entered them into his database as normal examples of the population. That's really sick. In addition, Kinsey relied heavily on volunteers. 6 years before the publication of Kinsey's volume, psychologist Abraham Maslow had pointed out that, quote, any study in which data are obtained from volunteers will always have a preponderance of aggressive, high dominance people, and therefore will show a falsely high percentage of non-virginity, masturbation, promiscuity, homosexuality, etc. in the population. Totally believe that. Kinsey Institute Director Paul Gebhard described Kinsey's approach. Quote, at the Indiana State Farm, we had no plan of sampling. We simply sought out sex offenders and after a time avoided the more common types of offense, such as statutory rape, and directed our efforts toward the rarer types. In the early stages of the research, when much interviewing was to be done at Indiana correctional institutions, Dr. Kinsey did not view the inmates as a discrete group that should be differentiated from people outside. Instead, he looked upon the institutions as reservoirs of potential interviewees, literally captive subjects. This viewpoint resulted in there being no differentiation in our 1948 volume between persons with and without prison experience. The great majority of the prison group was collected omnivorously without any sampling plan. We simply interviewed all who volunteered, and when this supply of subjects was exhausted, we solicited other inmates essentially at random. Kinsey never kept a record of refusal rates, the proportion of those who were asked for an interview, but who refused, which goes to the other point. If you're looking for volunteers, that group is going to be self-selected for people who volunteer, and there may be highly correlated personality traits with that, as the previous who was saying it, as Maslow said. But think about if he had actually done two studies, one of sexually deviant prisoners and one of the general population. It would have actually proven by far the opposite, no doubt. It would have shown how non-deviant, I mean, it's almost like a tautology. Obviously, the mainstream can't be deviant because what does deviant mean? But yes, so instead of actually doing good science, he intentionally did bad science. Kinsey's manipulation extended to his choice of staff. His assistants in his studies were selected from young students, both male and female, who were required prior to coming on board to provide their sexual histories. I probably wouldn't even have done that. So that's self-selection right there. Another requirement was that they be filmed in explicit sexual movies, ostensibly for research, filmed in Kinsey's attic. Psychologist Wardell Pomeroy, who worked with Kinsey, reports that the public would have been astounded and disbelieving to know the names of the eminent scientists who appeared at the Institute from time to time to examine our work and talk with Kinsey, and who volunteered before they left to be photographed in some kind of sexual activity. Kinsey's research included observation of child